Hello and welcome back to another episode of Let's Build an E-commerce Store with a Spring Boot Backend. Episode 17, Updating Addresses. So, today's objectives. Number 1, we've got allow users to get, add, and update their addresses. And number 2, we're going to test that new functionality. So this is a rather short one. It's just kind of in preparation for WebSockets, which is going to be the next couple of episodes. So in preparation of that, we need the ability to do this kind of changing of data so that the WebSockets actually have something to display and test. So let's get straight into the development environment and get with it. Okay, so here we are in our development environment, and just before the episode, I've started up our application. We can ignore these this error message, that's just because I don't have the SMTP server running at the moment. But if we go into Postman, and we have the auth/me, which is how we get the user object, and we query that, we can see that we have this user information here, but we don't have the address. So we need a way for the front end to retrieve addresses for the user. So let's start by going into our code, and we're going to add a new package under controller. We're going to call that package user, and then a new class. That's going to be our user controller, and then that means we need to do our annotations up here at the top. I'm just going to change the keyboard layout because for whatever reason it's decided to change. So we're going to use the REST controller annotation to say that this is a REST controller, and then we're going to use the request mapping to prefix all our requests to /user. So obviously in the future we'll have some other different methods in here for the user, but we're just building up the address stuff here. So the way I like to think of it is the authentication controller is for authentication, so login and registration, and also for identifying who is currently logged in. The user controller, though, is for actually handling the user's information, so stuff like updating their password or whatever. So that's why there's that separation. Personally, is how I like to separate it. So we're going to be getting information about the addresses here out of the database. So to be able to do that, we need to have a DAO for that. So we're going to create a new interface called address DAO. And just like the others, we're going to extend list CRUD repository. Extends list CRUD repository, address, and the long ID that we use for the key type. And we're going to need one example of a method we're going to need off the bat. So we're going to need to find a collection. So we're going to list based off of the user's ID. Okay, so that's our little method stub to get all addresses where there is a user ID of the given ID. Okay, so let's plumb in our address DAO we've just made, and we'll make a constructor for that. There we go. And so first things first, we need to get a list of our addresses. So let's do a get mapping for / and then we do curly brace user ID curly brace, and that indicates that this here is a property. This is a variable in the URL that we want to fetch out of the URL to be able to manipulate data, and then / address because we want to get the address of that user. So when the API is called, it will go user / user ID / address, and if you do that, you'll get all of the addresses for that user. So public response entity is what we're returning, which will return a list of addresses. So we'll just do list of address like that. And if we just correct that error, import the list, there we go. So then we want to do get address. And we need to return, so if we do at, what is it again? It's a path variable. And then you can specify the name of the path variable in here. I think it's like name is equal to. But if your variable name is the same as the variable name in this curly bracket, then it automatically associates it for you. So string user ID. And then we're going to do a very simple response actually. So just return response entity dot OK, and then address DAO dot find by user ID, and then the user ID we've been provided. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, we can just type this to long, because it will automatically convert the string in the URL to the long for us. So there we go. Let's restart that and see what happens now. So we're going to Postman, and while that's loading in the background, let's duplicate our auth me tab. I'm just going to bring that over here. Actually, let's leave it at the end. So we're going to change this to be user/address. But remember, we need another slash here to put on our ID. So if we go back to our auth me, you can see I'm currently logged in as ID 8. All right. So if I put in ID 8 here, so user 8 address, and hit send, you see I get my address here, 123 Tester Hill, Testington, England. There we go, perfect. But what happens if I go, okay, well, 9. Well, that's not my address. I'm logged in as user 8 still. Well, that's because we've not done any permission checking around this number. So let's do that. Now remember, we're going to have to do this permission check multiple times. So let's make a private method that does that for us, so it's less repetitive. So we do private boolean user has permission, and then we go local user and long ID. We can then return user dot. If we just import the local user class first, user.getID is equal to ID. Okay, so in the future we may make it so that there's an administrator user who can go in and change the address of a user on purpose, or maybe change other things of the user. That's where we can then extend this to go, for example, or user.has change user permission. Right, something like that, and we could extend the method to take a change type or change the item it's changing. But that's the idea, is we're centralizing it, so it's a bit easier. So how do we block this? So we want to go if the user does not have permission, and we need to get our user here. So how do we get that? If you remember in a previous episode, what we had was the authentication principle. So at authentication principle local user, and that allows us to go here and go user and then user ID. And if they don't have permission, we want to return response entity dot state do we have dot forbidden? No, dot status http status dot forbidden dot build, and there we go. So now let's run this again and retest our little scenario we had there. So that's loading in the background. So we see we're looking for number 9. We hit send for a 3 forbidden. That's perfect. And if we go back to our 8, which is what our number is, we get our response. So that's brilliant. There we go. So now, how do we add a user? Well, you could have post mappings where if you supply no ID, then it automatically knows to. But if you don't, but there's another way of doing this. You can also use different methods, because there's lots of different HTTP methods. So you've got all of these down here that you could use. And the ones that I would use personally is you've got post, but I think post of more of I'm submitting some data to you to process. I prefer to use put and patch and delete and get. So put means you're adding some new data. Patch means you're changing some data. Delete means you're deleting some data. Get means getting some data. And then post means I'm posting something for you to acknowledge and return. So let's do a put mapping. So at put mapping, and then we want to do / curly braces user ID / address. And then down below that, we're going to do public response entity, and then we'll return the successfully built address. So that's what we're going to return there. And we're going to do put address, and then just like before, we're going to need our authentication principle out of that. So there we go, user. We're also going to need our path variable for the user ID out of it. And then finally, we're also going to need a request body of an address, because that's the data that they're sending us. Okay, so we can copy our previously used bit here to tell if the user's trying to change address for a user they don't have permission to. And then finally, what we want to do is we want to do some extra checks. So we're putting some data here. We're not going in and changing data. So we want to make sure that we're not going to, nobody can trick Hibernate into thinking that this is address number 5 when, when the user isn't belonging to address 5. So what we can do here is we can go address.setID is null. And all the other fields, if we go into the address class, you can see here that the user is ignored. So if someone tries to set the user, that won't work. So that's all fine. But it's all these other fields. These fields we do want them changing. So we don't need to put any extra methods in there to prevent that from happening. So we can do address.setID null. And then finally, what we need to do is we actually need to associate this address to the user. And there's a little cheat that you can do here. So we're going to do local user and call it ref user equals new local user. And then we can do ref user.setID is equal to user ID. Now, why might we want to do this as opposed to just set user is equal to ref user? So set ID, ref user.setID is that, and then you do address.setUser ref user. Now, a question you might ask is, why don't we just do set user? We already have the user in hand. Well, if you remember what we were saying here, what if you had an administrative role where the administrator can change things? Well, if the administrator was the one who was adding an address to someone else's account, well, what that would happen is you would get the administrator's user here, not this user's user instance here. So then you're going to insert it incorrectly. So a nice little trick is that if you create a user object and fill in the key, because Hibernate's only going to look at that key, we're not cascading down those changes. You can see here, we don't cascade any changes to the user. We can generate a fake dummy user instance with that ID, so that when it pushes that data down, it's pushing down with the user ID. Sorry about that. Right, so as you can see here, we've got address.setUser, so we have our user assigned to it now. So then finally what we can do is we can just do return response-entity.ok and then address.dao.save the address. So let's have a look at what we've done here again. So we're checking that the user has permission to edit that user. Then we're setting the ID of the address to null, just in case someone's trying to bug out the system and allow them to change somebody else's address. We're then going to create a dummy user and set that ID to the user. And then we're going to assign that dummy user to the address and save it to the database, returning the output back. And the beauty of returning what the save is returning, the save method, because we're returning that, will return the new ID of the address too. So when the front end receives this, sends this add user address to us, it doesn't need to do another query to the database to go, oh, can I have this address, please? It's already got it. You can just add it to its existing data. So it's pretty good way of doing it. It's a bit of a performance thing. So let's restart this and test this now. So we're going to come into Postman and duplicate this tab and change it to put. And we're going to copy the address that we've got here and just drop it into the body with raw JSON into here. So we're doing a put on user 8 address. You can see here I'm going to put 2 at the end of this, at the end of all of these, so we know that this is the second one. And I'm going to leave the ID 1 here just to prove that point. So let's hit send. And as you can see, we've been returned with ID 3 instead of 1, which is brilliant. Status 200, so that's okay. And if we come back to our get from before and hit send again, you can see we now have our second set of data in there. Brilliant. So now let's see how we update that data. So let's come in here and drop down a line. We're going to do a patch mapping. And this time it's going to be / curly braces user ID /address / and then address ID. That's another curly brackets. And this means that we've got a user ID and an address ID. We'll come into the complications of that in a second. So we've got response entity address again, just so that we're returning the completed address. And go patch address, and then we've got our normal ones again. So authentication protocol principal, and local user at path variable long user ID. And then we've got at path variable, another one here this time, remember. So long address ID. And then we've got request body address, because they're going to be sending us an address that they've changed. So, oh, sorry. Right, so again, we're going to do our little check here to see if the user has permissions to edit that user. Oops. Oh, what have I done? Let's copy this again. There we go. Right. So let's think about this. What kind of things do we need to check? So firstly, let's say if we don't get anything good here, right, we're just going to return response entity .bad request. Okay. Build. So what can we check first? So we can check that the address ID in the URL matches the address in the request body. So we can do if address.getID is equal to address ID. Okay, so remember, if otherwise it's going to come down here and return bad request. So what else can we check? Well, we need to check that the address that we're editing, the ID, does actually belong to the user that we're referring to. So we can go optional. And also partly is, does the address even exist? So optional address, optional op original address is what I'm going to call it, is equal to address DAO dot find by ID address ID. Oh, that's wrong. There we go. What's it not liking here? There we go. Didn't want to import for some reason. Very strange. Okay, so we've got that, and then we want to say if the optional original address is present, then we're going to continue. Otherwise, a bad request again. And then we can do if here we go. If optional address dot get user dot get ID. Double checking. Yep, yeah. Is equal to user ID. So what we're doing here is we're saying, right, so the optional address exists, right? So get the address, the original address, get the user from that address, and get that user's ID. Is it equal to the ID that we're processing up here? Okay, because that's what we've checked. We're checking that the user, the authentication principal has permission to edit the user ID up here. So inherently, they have permission to update this address, unless we do more advanced permissioning down the line. But inherently they do, according to our current system. And therefore, we just need to check that this address does belong to this user. So now we've got all the building pieces in place, we can simply just go address dot set user, because remember, they've provided us with this address, but it's not going to have the user reference in there. And this time we can just go and copy what we've got up here and actually just output it to be local user equals that. And then we can go original user instead. And then go user.getID, set it to there as well. And then we can do address DAO.save address, and we're going to wrap this in a return response entity.ok, like so. There we go. So let's have a look at this, what this is doing. So we're checking that the user has permission to edit that user. The logged in user has permission to edit that user ID. Then we're checking, does the address IDs match from the body to the URL. Then we're checking to see if the address even exists. Then we're checking to see if the address belongs to the user that we've been provided. Then we're setting the user's reference into our updated address field, our updated address body, should I say. And then we're saving that address away to the database with a response entity OK. And if any of these fail, apart from the top one obviously, we return bad request. So let's restart our application and give this a go. So we can come up here and we can duplicate this tab. And we're going to put in /3 and copy this JSON from down here and drop that into the body. So what we're doing here is we're saying, well, I'm user 8, please let me update address 3, and here's my new address 3. So let's change that to address 1 and see what happens. We get 405 method not allowed. Oh, it's because I put patch. There we go. Resend that. 400 bad request. Lovely. So let's change this to 3 and the URL to 1. Again, bad request. And if I changed it to 9, for example, forbidden because we're not using number 9. So let's do that to 3, and that stays in 3. And we can see we've got all these bits and pieces of data. Let's change them to have 2 2s after them. And hit send. So it's 200, okay. We've been returned our new and updated address. And if we go back to our get method and hit send again, and scroll down, you can see we've got the 2 2s after everything. Perfect. So there we go. We've done our little preparation for WebSockets because we needed something to work with the WebSockets on. So this is a good starting point. So this is the end of the episode, basically, because we've kind of done what we want. The JUniting for this I'm going to do as part of the WebSocket tutorial because we're going to have to do JUniting of WebSockets. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. It's been lovely to have you here again. As always, in my channel, there's a playlist of all the videos in order if you feel like to watch them. Please feel free to like and subscribe, and commenting any feedback not only helps me, but helps other people as well. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.